Pack your things, my mother said, stepping over my grandfather's threshold with a triumphant smirk while my sister immediately started claiming bedrooms upstairs. They hadn't called or visited in 15 years. Not since they dropped me off at Grandpa Arthur's porch when I was 5 and drove away forever. But the moment his heart stopped, they materialized like vultures smelling blood, ready to strip away his historic estate. They thought I was still that helpless, abandoned child they could throw out on the street. They didn't know I had stayed by his side, earned his trust, and followed his final instruction to the letter. And then, the heavy oak door of his private study slowly swung open, and the color drained completely from their faces. The gray sedan idling in the gravel driveway didn't even turn its engine off. I was 5 years old, clutching a small, duct-taped cardboard suitcase, standing on the wraparound porch of my grandfather's creaky Victorian house. My mother rolled down the passenger window, her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to look at me. "Be good for your grandfather," she had said, her voice completely hollow. My father just slammed his door shut, put the car in reverse, and sped down the long country lane, kicking up dust that settled over my shoes. They didn't call the next day, or the next month. In fact, they never looked back. To them, I was a discarded burden, an inconvenient anchor holding back their corporate ambitions. But what they didn't know was that the very house they abandoned me at would become my entire world. Grandpa Arthur didn't talk much, but his actions spoke volumes. He taught me how to fix broken fences, how to read heavy leather-bound books by the fireplace, and how to stand tall when the world tries to break you. While my parents built a glossy, high-society life in the city, forgetting they ever had a firstborn, Arthur quietly built something else. He taught me resilience, patience, and how to spot a lie a mile away. As the years rolled by, my parents vanished into a distant, hazy memory, replaced by the steady ticking of grandfather clocks and the quiet strength of a man who loved me when no one else would. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times, heavy and slow, marking the exact moment my entire world shifted. Grandpa Arthur was 82, his hands calloused from decades of woodworking, his eyes still sharp as tacks. But that afternoon, his breathing had grown shallow, the raspy sound filling the quiet room. I sat beside his bed, holding his rough, warm hand just like I had done every day for the past 15 years. He squeezed my fingers one last time, a weak, knowing smile touching his lips. Then, the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest simply stopped. He was gone. I didn't cry right away. The shock locked my throat. But I didn't even have 5 minutes to process the grief of losing the only true parent I had ever known before the heavy front door swung open with a loud, mocking bang. Laughter echoed through the sacred silence of the hallway, strangers' laughter, or rather, ghosts from a past I had buried long ago. My mother strutted into the foyer, looking like she was walking down a high-fashion runway, wrapped in expensive designer wool and dripping in gold jewelry. Right behind her was my younger sister, Chloe, who I hadn't seen since she was a toddler, scrolling lazily on a brand-new smartphone. And trailing them was a man I barely recognized as my father, his hair graying at the temples, wearing an expensive suit that reeked of corporate arrogance. They hadn't called or visited in a decade and a half, but the moment Arthur's heart stopped, they materialized like vultures smelling blood, ready to devour everything he had left behind. "Well, it looks dusty, but the bones of this place are incredible," my mother announced, marching into the living room as if she were inspecting a hotel suite rather than a house in mourning. She didn't even look at me, standing frozen by the doorway. Chloe immediately dropped her bag on the vintage armchair, walking around and tapping the antique wood paneling with an approving nod. "I'll take the master bedroom upstairs, the one with the balcony," Chloe declared, flashing a self-satisfied grin. "It has the best lighting for my social media content." My father walked over to the liquor cabinet, pouring himself a glass of Arthur's expensive scotch without a word of greeting or condolence. They treated the entire space like a prize to be divided rather than a home where a man had just breathed his last breath. Finally, my mother turned her cold gaze toward me, her expression hardening into absolute disdain. "Pack your single bag and get out by tonight," she ordered, crossing her arms. We're selling this estate immediately, and your presence here is an embarrassment we don't need in our social circle. You've always been a parasite, clinging to the old man because you couldn't make it on your own. Consider this your eviction notice. We own everything now, and you have zero rights to a single brick of this property." They stared at me with smug, unshakable confidence, entirely convinced that they held absolute legal and emotional power over my life, completely blind to the trap they had just walked into. Instead of crumbling under their insults or rushing to pack a single bag, I simply stood my ground and let out a calm, quiet breath. Let them play emperor in a kingdom they didn't understand. They assumed I was still that helpless 5-year-old child they had thrown away, completely blind to the fact that I had spent the last 15 years learning every single detail of this estate and building a shield they couldn't penetrate. My hand slid into the deep pocket of my jacket, my fingers brushing against a heavy, cold object. It was a unique brass key, worn smooth at the edges from years of safe custody. Memories flashed through my mind of just 1 week ago, when Grandpa Arthur knew his time was running out. He had called me into his private study, his breathing heavy, but his voice steady and sharp. He handed me a sealed, thick manila envelope stamped with red wax and bound with a heavy brass clasp. "They will come back the moment I'm gone," Arthur had told me, his eyes burning with fierce determination. "They think blood makes them owners, but loyalty makes a home. Follow my final instructions to the letter, and let them think they've won until the very last second." I hadn't just been living in his shadow. I had been working closely with his trusted estate attorney, executing a meticulous legal preparation that completely locked down every square inch of the property. My mother snapped her fingers impatiently, breaking me out of my thoughts. "Did you hear me? I said pack your bags and get out of our sight right now." I looked straight into her cold eyes, offering a faint, knowing smile that instantly made her uneasy. "You want the master deed and the property titles, right?" I asked, my voice cutting through the smug silence of the room. My mother paused, her eyebrows arching in surprise that I wasn't crying or arguing. "Well, obviously," she snapped, stepping forward. "Hand them over before I call the authorities to have you physically thrown out." I didn't flinch. Instead, I turned on my heel and walked slowly down the long hallway toward the heavy oak door of Arthur's private study, a room they had always been strictly forbidden from entering even when they were children. "Then come and get them," I said over my shoulder. My father and sister exchanged bewildered glances, but greed outweighed their caution, and they followed close behind. I reached the brass handle, pulled out the unique key Arthur had given me, and slid it into the lock with a satisfying, metallic click. The heavy door swung open, revealing a room bathed in afternoon light, dominated by a large mahogany desk covered in stacked files and legal binders. They marched inside, looking around at the leather-bound books and expensive artifacts, completely unaware of the trap closing around them. "Sit down," I said, gesturing to the leather chairs facing the desk. "It's time for a family meeting, and I think you'll want to pay very close attention to every single word." My father folded his arms, scoffing as he leaned against the mahogany bookshelf. "Cut the drama, kid. Hand over the paperwork so we can call the real estate agent and get this over with." I didn't blink. I walked slowly behind the desk, picked up the thick manila envelope Arthur had given me, and slid out a set of crisp, formal legal documents bearing the embossed seal of a high-powered estate firm. "This isn't a standard will," I said clearly, my voice echoing in the quiet study. My mother frowned, taking a sharp step forward. "What are you talking about? Give me that." I held the papers out just enough for her to read the bold header. It was a comprehensive, airtight, irrevocable trust and deed transfer executed 3 years ago. On August 14th, 2023, Grandpa Arthur legally amended his entire estate, I explained, watching the color begin to drain from her face. He didn't just leave the house to me. He established a total asset shield. My father snatched the document from my hand, his eyes frantically scanning the legal jargon. Printed in black and white was the explicit clause Arthur had insisted on adding, due to total abandonment, emotional neglect, and explicit breach of moral and familial duty demonstrated by my biological children on date. 2011. They are hereby and permanently disinherited from any claim, right, or access to this property or any associated assets. My sister let out a high-pitched gasp, her dream of a luxury inheritance shattering into a million pieces. The silence in the room became suffocating as they realized every single dollar, every brick, and every square inch of the estate belonged entirely to me. My mother's face turned an ash gray, her hands trembling as she dropped the papers back onto the mahogany desk. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice cracking with sudden panic. "We're your family." "Family?" I replied, stepping out from behind the desk and holding up the heavy brass key. "You stopped being family 15 years ago on a dusty gravel driveway. Now you're legally trespassing on my property." My father started to shout, threatening lawsuits and corrupt lawyers, but I simply pointed toward the open doorway. "You have 5 minutes to walk out that front door, or I call county sheriffs to escort you off the premises." Realizing they had zero legal footing, zero inheritance, and absolute defeat staring them in the face, the fierce arrogance melted away. My sister was already crying, storming out of the room and slamming the front door behind her. My parents backed out slowly, their heads hung low, defeated by the very legacy they thought they could steal. As the front door clicked shut, the heavy weight of the past finally lifted off my shoulders. I stood alone in the quiet study, completely free, ready to build my own future on my own terms.